wrong? Did we make the wrong decision after all?
Yes, it is time once again that I get to review an anime, and I will say that after watching all the episodes, this is a pretty intriguing one, especially to go and talk about. Now, I will admit that I knew nothing about this anime beforehand. In fact, the first time I ever heard about this was through a Patreon request where someone asked me to go and review Gungrave, and well, let's just say, here I am, making a review and talking about my thoughts on this anime in particular. But when looking into how it got made or how did it come to be in the first place, it's actually pretty interesting because usually when I would go and review these animes, usually they would be inspired by a manga where the manga itself would be very popular and some animation studio in Japan decided to say, you know what, let's go and bring this to life through animation. But this is not really the case because Gungrave is actually based on a video game, specifically the 2002 game of the same name by Red Entertainment. And apparently it was actually made by Yasuhiro Naitao. I think that's how you say his name. He is also noted to be the creator of Trigun. And in terms of the reception of the game, in case you haven't heard of that one, like the original Gungrave, apparently the reviews are like from positive to mixed, where I would say on average, it's the kind of game that would get a 6 out of 10. You know, it's not the best PS2 game out there, but I mean, it's not necessarily awful. At least that's what the critics said about that game in particular. And I guess what happened afterwards, because there's not a whole lot of history that has been recorded about Gungrave, but I guess there was someone at Madhouse who saw the game and they said, you know what? Let's go and turn that into an anime. Now, this is not necessarily a big anime per se, because it only lasted for a total of just 26 episodes, airing between October of 2003 up until March of 2004. So they pretty much made this not long after the release of the original game. And here we are right now where a few decades later, I get to go and actually experience this and to go and talk to you all about the things that I have seen with this anime. And honestly, even through those 26 episodes, I have seen quite a lot. And before I actually do get into the actual anime itself and to discuss what it's all about, I need to go and talk to you all about the first episode in particular. I know it sounds a little bit weird, but trust me, it's going to make sense a little later to why I have to bring this up, because trust me, you're about to get into a very unexpected turn later. So when you do begin with the first episode, when you do begin binge watching Gungrave, it starts out, I would say, a lot more like your typical action-packed anime, where you got this superhuman protagonist who is all about guns. In fact, he's pretty much dressed like a cowboy. And I gotta say, one thing that did make me laugh, because it's like so stupidly cheesy, is that the name of the character is called Brandon Heat. So like already, like they already gave him like this stupid pun of a name. But also he does have a nickname, which is why this is called Gungrave, because apparently he's also referred to as Beyond the Grave, which they would go and explain that a little bit later. So with that introduction to Brandon Heat, aka Beyond the Grave, there was honestly something about him that reminds me a bit of Shadow the Hedgehog, where this is a character that would be categorized a little bit as edgy, where he's not a whole lot of a talker and his specialty is with guns, where really the big appeal of him is the edgy side of the guy, where he's like someone who completely hides all of his emotions, and he would be the most active whenever there's some major action going on, especially when he would have to go and bring out his gun. But then suddenly there was one moment in that episode that really caught me off guard, because I was proven to be pretty much wrong in terms of that comparison to Shadow the Hedgehog. He's not a bit like him. He's actually a whole lot like Shadow the Hedgehog, because there was just one instance where he just had a memory flashback and he uttered the words,
Maria.
And who is this Maria? Well, believe it or not, it actually is this blonde woman in his past that he cared very much for, and nowadays, well, she passed away. So it's only the memories that he has left of her, and it turned out to be one thing to be a strong motivator for him. So honestly, it kind of made me question from there, like, okay, so who the fridge came first? Is it Shadow the Hedgehog, or is it Brandon Heat? Because honestly, the parallels and the similarities that they have is just way too unavoidable, especially if you're gonna bring up that Maria aspect on it. I'm sorry, there's no way that I can watch this and not think about Shadow the Hedgehog. Anyways, with Beyond the Grave in the first episode, he would come out and he would be shooting these demon-type monsters with some of these over-the-top guns. Some of these that they look like they came from a Bayonetta game. And from there, we also get to introduce some of the characters, and then they would get into a lot of the action as well, and just, you know, giving us a little bit of a taste of what would be to come, as well as you would also have like the allies of Beyond the Grave, such as this little helpless girl who is always by his side and like wants to show like this humanity side to the protagonist. And then you also have the wise doctor who's helping him with all the equipment and stuff like that, and some of the things to keep him alive as well. So it starts out, again, much like what you would expect from an anime that's a lot more action-oriented. You would get a lot of the gunslinging action of just taking down these demon monsters one by one, and like you would probably expect that you'll see like a variety of these different types of monsters. But then you would go and enter upon episode 2. And that is where the real anime begins, and whatever themes that they would go and try to establish, like whatever fantastical or sci-fi elements that they have presented in episode 1, yeah, they don't actually come back after quite a while. So after the first episode, what the anime is really about is regarding these two individuals by the name of Brandon Heat and Harry McDowell. And you see their life as they started out in the bottom of the food chain, where they were just trying to survive in the slums in a very crime-infested town. And from there, their luck completely changed when they decided to go and join the Mafia, which in this case is an organization called Millennium. And from there, you see how these two would work together, or even work individually, where they would slowly but surely rise to the top, where they would go and climb up the hierarchy of Millennium. And as they would try to establish some relationships and sometimes some betrayals, you would slowly but surely see how they would go and rise, but also how both of them, they have these different goals, especially with different points of views on life, where Harry is a lot more about trying to really climb up to the top, whatever it takes, while Brandon, he becomes a lot more loyal to the organization itself, along with some of the people. And I'll explain later that one thing that is also considered a bit of a virtue, but also like an important aspect about Brandon, is that he is a very selfless person, and that whatever his motives are, he would do it for the organization as much as he would do it for those that he would care about. So when we do see Brandon and Harry trying to climb up the ranks within Millennium, That's when I find that the anime just got very interesting because, like I said before, all those elements that we have seen that is like based on fantasy or sci-fi or any of the over-the-top action moments, they're pretty much gone. And that's when the anime decided to completely root itself into reality. And the best way that I can go and describe Gungrave by that point is that it's pretty much like if you mix Goodfellas with John Wick, where it is heavily based on this mafia crime family, and you slowly get to know some of the pivotal members that surround both Harry and Brandon. But at the same time, while you mainly focus on Brandon Heat and his side of the story and what he has to do for the operation or for the organization, he's pretty much like John Wick, where he becomes Millennium's greatest hitman, where he is just an expert hitman. He can take out anyone just so efficiently, and it's through his skills where he would go and like really climb up the ranks within Millennium.
It was Brandon. He's become the symbol of Millennium's power. He's maintaining the organization's image from the foundation up.
And this is where I personally find that the biggest strength that this anime has, and what I personally find to be very impressive with Gungrave, is that it has some very strong character development. Like, this anime really takes the time to get to know many of these people, not just with Harry and Brandon, which I will get to later, because honestly, I want to save the best character arcs for last, but you also get to know a lot of the people, rather it be the ones who literally are at the top, like Big Daddy, who is considered the head honcho of the entire organization, but you also get to know about the people that both Brandon and Harry would go and work with. And you see their side as well through their interactions with those guys and through their personal relationships and what they're going through as well. You do get to learn a lot more about who they are, as well as their role within Millennium and what can they do for both the characters and for the organization itself. And it really becomes very fascinating because like you don't just learn them for the sake of the plot, but also you get some time to go and emotionally connect with them. Like, you actually do see the human side of many of these characters, and you see how they also have their own personal lives, and sometimes there are moments where they can massively conflict with the mission that Millennium wants to do when it comes to running their business and organizing what they are doing and trying to fend off any of their rivals and stuff like that. It truly is fascinating because there is that additional layer where you see that you want to emotionally connect with them, that suddenly it's not just about the organization, but also you care about their well-beings, that these are people who have their own lives, and sometimes it's not easy to be a part of the mafia while trying to have a wife and kids and trying to organize everything efficiently. Like, there are some things that like they can manage to balance their life and work together, but then there are some things that mix as well as oil and water. And there are plenty of great examples, and it doesn't just have to directly correlate to being with Harry or with Brandon. Like, there are some side characters, like there are two people who are like among the top, and they would just hang out with like two older members of Millennium, and they have been good friends for quite a while, and they would just hang out with one another. And there are some times like you know, it's very nice to see them just connect as friends, you know, that like they're not just co-workers, but also they can have their own heartbreaking moments. And also I would like to say, like, I'll get to this a little bit later, but speaking of the mafia aspect, or actually I might as well go and fully dive into this part, because yes, there are some action scenes in there. While they're not as over the top as the first episode, you do get to see some actual like mafia style action scenes where everybody like gets out their guns and like like they got to shoot each other to survive, or to make sure that their side of the mafia team would end up becoming the winner, so that like their balance can go and be maintained within the area. And from there, you see them you see like the action just flow very naturally, and they can actually get pretty engaging, especially when there are scenes in which you see Brandon be a part of, where like you see like his skills as a gunman like really put to great use. And also I would like to add that there are plenty of moments, and another great strength of Gungrave is that they really play with suspense very well. Like there are some times where like whatever moment happens, like sometimes you question like, are we going to see a death in this? Are we going to see someone get whacked off, or someone like lose their life in that moment? And usually, well, I mean, considering that it is the mafia, the answer would be yes. But in this case, sometimes like you see that moment of suspense, that like there's this long pause between a character pulling out their gun and then suddenly they would go and immediately shoot. So I will say, like, when it comes to those moments of action and suspense, like when the emotions suddenly get really high, or maybe not emotions, although like, yeah, they do have some strong emotional moments. There are some times when the intensity can get very high as well. So I will say that is another great thing about this anime, that it does play with intensity very well. But even though I have said like a lot of these characters, like they can be great, they can be memorable, especially on a more human level, they pale in compare to the two main leads. Like the other characters, I mean, they are very solid, but these the two main characters that they have established here, they are fantastic. As much as I laughed about Brandon Heed and his cheesy name in the beginning, the way that they have built this character, especially when you see him climb up the ranks, it's honestly someone that I consider to be very admirable and just very fascinating to watch. Like, yeah, you do see some of those elements from that first episode that would go and define his character, where he is more of a strong, silent type. He's not necessarily someone who is known for showing his emotions or to express his feelings or to even talk a whole lot in the first place. But you can see that this is a character whom debatably has the biggest heart, because the thing with Brandon and what makes him interesting and even likable as a character is that he is very selfless, where his actions are rarely for himself and more for the sake of others. And you could tell that even though he doesn't talk much, he cares very much about the people that are in his life. He cares about his friends, especially with Harry. He cares about Maria, in which you do see that there is kind of this established relationship going on, and that while it's not really a full-on love connection that is going on, like you could tell that he does care about her a whole lot. And of course, he cares about the organization. He cares about Millennium. And speaking of that selflessness, there is actually one great example that shows that, in which it actually, funny enough, makes Brandon a bit more heartfelt, in which not only does he care about the people that he considers a bit like his family or his friends, like with Harry or Maria and stuff like that, but also you actually see that he cares about the people that he once hanged out with. Like when he started working at Millennium, there were two characters that they have their own boisterous personalities that Brandon would go and hang out. And from time to time, you see these characters actually come back because even though Brandon would be rising higher and higher within the hierarchy of Millennium, he still cares about those that he used to work for, and that he would actually do some favors for them. And honestly, it feels very sweet, and it is an attribute that does emphasize that when you do get on your good side, or when you do show some humanity to Brandon, he will give that humanity back, and that he will, like, maybe he won't express it with his words, but he will express it again with his actions, that he does care if you show some kindness and some care to him. So again, it's a great example of his selflessness, and really adds on to the charm and the likability of Brandon. But what's very interesting with his arc is that when you do see his rise, he becomes more and more of a soulless character. And by the way, this is going to be an extremely rare occasion where when I say soulless, is actually done so in a pretty good way. I mean soulless as in his priority becomes more and more about Millennium, in which he cares about the organization and almost nothing else. Like, he wants to make sure that the pride and the honor of the organization is his most important duty. Like, he lives by the organization and he dies by the organization, down to the point where he feels like he cannot have an actual human connection with other people, especially when he has to be this sweeper, when he has to be like the hitman that he is. And and I remember there was one scene in particular where you actually do see, like, I'm not going to spoil a whole lot, but there is a moment where he would be reunited with Maria, and I'm just going to say, like, that moment is just cold. Like, you could tell, like, the feelings that he used to have for Maria is just flat out gone, and that his priority as a hitman for Millennium is like his purpose in life. He's not a family man, he's not a people person, he is just straight up a hitman. And the emotions that he has displayed for Maria, which is like next to none, it was just a scene where, like, you just realize, oh wow, like, the evolution of what he became. Like, yeah, there are some strengths to it, but there's also some major downsides where it's like, oh my god, like, this is exactly why I said that he has kind of become soulless, where, you know, like, the human side of him just feels like he's completely gone. Like, the Brandon that they have established before is kind of gone, and now you're kind of left with Brandon the hitman.
I won't betray the family.
Although I will say it is not 100% gone. It's just that it's kind of like shocking and a little bit heartbreaking to see, like, how Millennium has completely transformed Brandon, where, like, there's so much of him that is so sacrificed in order to become so loyal to the organization. And from there, it's just very fascinating to go and see. And yeah, there probably are a few times where you do see some of that soul, some of that human side, like, slowly show up, where he does start to care about others, such as Big Daddy or Maria or his friends, like with Harry, show up. And yeah, like, I'm not gonna go too much into it, because if I say more, then it would be like really spoiler territory. But yeah, honestly, the way they crafted Branded Heat is just very fascinating and very well done.
Maria's voice. I can't hear it anymore.
But then you also have Harry McDowell, and oh boy, this character. Now, this is someone, I will say, he's a little bit of the opposite of Brandon Heat, where he's a lot more charismatic, he talks a lot more, and this is the kind of guy whom he can go and try to have a conversation with you, and then suddenly he'll just get what he wants. And the way that we see him go and climb up the rank, honestly, there's just something that is so fascinating. And I mean, considering that they did establish this in the first episode, I just find it to be very intriguing in the way that they portray him as just such an evil genius, because throughout the episodes, you kind of do see slowly but surely what's going on in his mind and what he is doing in order to try to get into the top. And like one by one, he would try to climb up the ladder of Millennium in order to make it to become like the big head honcho and to possibly replace Big Daddy. And as the more episodes go by, at first it seems like, okay, you know, you're very much cool with Harry, like you're charmed by his charisma, and you see like you mainly know him as Brandon's good buddy, and that he's going to be a great helper to go and help elevate Brandon so that he can also rise to the top along with Harry. But then as the more episodes go by, the more sinister and the more twisted that Harry becomes. And suddenly his strategies in order to go and rise to the top, suddenly they become a little bit more dirty. And suddenly you see a bit more sabotagey. And along with that, you know, like there are some things that Harry would go and do that at first you wouldn't really think too much of it. You wouldn't necessarily think like, okay, he's just doing his usual like trickery in order to try to get himself elevated, to get himself to the top, or that, you know, he's trying to lavish in his own new lifestyle of being part of the Millennium family and stuff like that. But then you realize that every move that he does is heavily calculated, and that later on you start to realize, oh, now you see why he would go and do this. Like there are some things that would prevent him from being one step down. Like there are some actions that would go and protect him from being screwed over, and a lot of the things that he would do, it was just crazy to see how he would try to go and become more and more powerful within Millennium. Like, honestly, it's a little bit twisted, and it's kind of weird to be praising this evil character. Like, I think it's safe to say that, yeah, he is the antagonist of Gungrave, but the way they try to portray him and the way that we see how he would go and really climb up the ranks, it's just very fascinating and very admirable. It's like an additional plot point where you do see how he would go and get his way to the top, and that, you know, later on you see how his strategies would go and change and how they become a lot more sinister.
I can't take Big Daddy's place. At least not alone, but as long as Brandon's there to back me up, no one would be able to stop me.
So from there, for several episodes, it really got me hooked, and it's just very fascinating how we got this very character-driven story, and especially the way that it handles the character development is just extremely strong, and it really does get you invested in knowing about the people within Millennium, and just to go and watch Brandon and Harry as they rise up the ranks within the mafia organization, where they would become increasingly powerful. And then suddenly, the morality of the things that they would do would often be put into to question. So from there, I gotta say, it's just very fascinating. But then again, the memory about experiencing what we have seen in that first episode, sometimes it would keep popping up. And there is a part of me that does admit that I honestly wished I haven't watched that first episode, because it really did spoil a lot of what would be to come later within the episodes. Like, suddenly there's like that flash of what that first episode established, and then they would say, oh, okay, so this is the direction that they're going to go with Harry, or, oh, okay, this might be the direction where they will go with Brandon and stuff like that, or like, oh, well, Maria is not going to last long, so eventually we will see how she would ultimately perish and stuff like that. So that honestly spoiled a little bit of the experience, where like often those flashing memories of what happened in the first episode would be carried on to here, especially with the fact that the big question remained, when the fridge are we going to see some of those weird science fiction stuff? When are we going to see those weird demonic monsters suddenly appear, and then you see Brandon suddenly getting these over-the-top guns that he would go and shoot and just destroy. Like, when is that going to happen? Well, I actually did take notes of that. And I would say that, well, funny enough, like, during a good chunk of some of the first episodes, you don't actually see any of those actual science fiction elements. Like, at the most, there's like these horse racing competitions, and the horses are like these weird Star Wars like creatures. But other than that, everything is rooted in reality. But then things start to change when episode 9 comes in. And that's the part where I would say that's when they would go and start introducing some of the sci-fi elements. And I'm going to be very honest with you all. This is the part where, in my opinion, the anime starts to go a little bit downhill from there. Because in episode 9, they would go and fully introduce a new character that is going to be the enemy of Millennium called Blood War. And he is this Ganondorf-looking kind of guy whom his purpose in life is to cause war. And he desperately wants to cause war against Millennium. And his partner, for many years while Blood War was in jail, he would go and introduce him this new machine that he's been developing for so long that he really wants to bring this to life in order to go and gain a lot more power. And it's this, it's apparently this process that they created called necrolization. And what necrolization is basically they bring dead bodies back to life, where they would become unstoppable servants to whoever would go and bring them back to life. So basically, they introduce these super zombies to go and try to fight against the people at Millennium, and to go and fight against people like Brandon and some of his friends and all that kind of stuff. And so from there, like, it just started to seem a little bit odd. And I feel like with what they have established with many of the realistic aspects from the previous episodes, like, suddenly, like, this weird science fiction thing, it just seems a little bit weird. Like, okay, like, I can understand if you would bring in some kind of some explanation, like maybe some kind of like super drug that, you know, makes the people a lot more powerful. But it just feels like now they're starting to take a bit of steps that feel like, okay, now they might go into some over-the-top type of territory, especially with the idea of bringing in like these zombie servants who are, for the most part, pretty immune to guns. And it starts to feel like from there, they would keep making up rules. Like, one thing I will say, like, despite the fact that they do an amazing job to go and describe about the characters and the people within Millennium, I don't feel like they do so great in terms of explaining some of the more science fiction elements or some of the more fantastical elements within there. Like, yeah, they would keep explaining about necrolization, but they keep using that as an excuse to try to make up the rules as they keep on going, because there are some things that often they make no sense, or it's just very convenient for this one moment that they have there. Like, for example, during one of the big battles against Blood War, he would try, you know, like, they were, you know, people like Brandon and some of his allies, they were pretty much winning, and like, it seems like, okay, now things are going our way, now we can actually win this war that Blood War established. But then suddenly Blood War decided to go and change things up, where he decided to necrolize himself. And funny enough, this Ganondorf looking guy decided to go and transform into Blanca from Street Fighter. And that's one thing that I also find pretty funny, because like, we got this one character who decided to transform from one video game character to the next. So it was strange, but honestly, it's just pretty funny. But yeah, going back to what I was talking about, it just seemed a little bit bizarre that I don't know. I just feel like it didn't necessarily need those science fiction elements because they established such a great base in terms of what this anime is all about. And then they want to try to go and add a little bit extra, like add some spice into it. But it just, for me, it just doesn't fit with this whole setting where like everything seems to be perfectly normal. And that it's all root, you know, like it's supposed to be like kind of set in our world per se, but no, they decided to go and give that little bit of a twist and use necrolization as an excuse to do whatever the fridge they want. And slowly but surely from there, we do start to see more and more of that sci-fi element start to emerge. And I would say that suddenly the sci-fi thing and all the necrolizations, including like some of the more evolved forms, like of course, like you see those zombie slaves, from there they would keep evolving down to the point where they would also become Frankenstein monsters, and then they would become like their own like supernatural organic being or whatever. But it's by episode 16, I would say, that's when suddenly the sci-fi part starts to take over, where this mafia type drama, suddenly that aspect is kind of gone. And I would even say even the character aspect kind of disappears. And then we go, like, we pretty much return to where we were in episode 1, starting with the end of episode 17 and in episode 18. So from there, they would just continue the story. And I would say that from there, they would just completely change the entire anime. I would even say that it's almost like it turned into a completely different anime where like all the reality aspect and the character development, it's pretty much all gone in favor of what they've pretty much teased in the first episode. It's a lot more action oriented. It's a lot more about the crazy sci-fi stuff. And it's all about the over-the-top aspects that they would go and introduce. And the more new components that they want to try to go and show, and the more ideas that they would have for the sci-fi things, honestly, I feel like the more ridiculous it becomes. Now, I will admit that I could see how, in terms of those concepts, they can be pretty cool on their own and they can work as their own anime, but I just feel like it is so weird to see how they would just go and transition from one reality-based anime that is its own thing, and then they would transition to something that is like completely different and just completely unexpected, and just like something like it felt like what I loved from like the previous anime that I had in Gungrave is pretty much all gone, and now we're back to more of this typical action-oriented anime that has a lot of guns and a lot of monsters to go and destroy. So honestly, it felt like it was just going down this downgrade because it wants to, like, the more it wants to try to do, the less interested that I personally feel about it. Now, I'll admit, I don't know if this is like a hot take that I'm going to say, or if I may end up upsetting some Gungrave fans, but I personally feel like when Gungrave is at its best, it's more during the moments where it is realistic, where it's just talking about the characters and nothing else. When it tries to be extra, when it tries to be over the top, when it really wants to emphasize its sci-fi elements, that's where honestly it just loses me a little bit, and I feel like it suddenly blends in with the crowd of all the other action-oriented animes. In fact, I would even say that a great comparison, like there's this one, like while this is all happening, one anime that it kind of reminds me of that kind of had the same problem is in regards to Kill la Kill, where for a good chunk of the episodes, it actually did a great job establishing what it is. Like, it established what the concept is all about, what to expect in the episodes. And from there, like, yeah, I was on board with it. I was excited. I was really engaged with what it was trying to do. But then suddenly, later in the episodes, they decided to go extra as well. They want to add the sudden twist and try to be a lot more extravagant. And that was at the point where I felt like with the plot twist that it established in Kill la Kill, it just completely jumped the shark. And while I wouldn't say it ruined the entire anime in general, I just felt like it really pushed it back from being like a completely great anime. And I feel like the more it tries hard to be extra, the less great that it actually is. And that's kind of the same feeling that I'm getting with Gungrave. It's just the fact that the more that it wants to do, the less that is actually appealing, because it's more the minimal aspects of just developing its characters, learning about the people within Millennium. That is the part where I feel like the true heart and soul of Gungrave is. And the fact that they decided to go and sacrifice that very well established attribute and replace it with like some of the typical anime, like destroying monsters, but this time themed with guns and stuff like that, it just feels a little bit disappointing. That's where it just becomes, well, in lack of a better term, a generic anime. Oh, you know what? I'm honestly very surprised that I have yet to talk about this. There's also regarding the animation, and in my opinion, I find that the animation of Gungrave is fine. You know, nothing too extraordinary about it, but I would say it is actually pretty good. Maybe it's not necessarily the best Japanese animation that you will find, and maybe there are some times where you will find some quirks, especially like there are certain scenes where you would see some people in suits, and sometimes their heads would be hilariously tiny in comparison, where it's a little bit like the Goombas in the 90s Super Mario movie. But, you know, that's just like very small, dumb nitpicks. But I would say a lot of it is pretty fine. Like the designs are pretty nice. You know, the backgrounds are also pretty good too. And also considering that this is an anime that is more rooted in reality, there's not a whole lot to go and discuss. But I will say there are some that I will say that the style of designs that they do have do fit within the time frame of that era in Japanese animation, where like they have those distinct 90s eyes that they would have, you know the kind of anime eyes that they had back then that you would also see like in anime like Sailor Moon and stuff like that. So there are some that can be a little bit like that as well. But also with the animation, I will say though, that they do play well in terms of the action scenes. Like they do a great job to show like the John Wick style gunslinging action or the gunfights that would commonly occur. And by the way, that is also another thing that is worth mentioning about Gungrave, is that it is very heavily gun-based, where it's kind of like it established this world where the necessities of life are food, water, shelter, and a gun. Like, there are very rare instances where you see characters use different weapons, but for the most part, everybody has a gun. And if you want to go into a fight, you gotta bring in a gun. And on top of that, I will say that it does kind of show that in terms of like the big sci-fi elements, that they are more for the animation aesthetic more so than it is for the plot aesthetic. And yeah, I can see how some people can actually like some of the cool designs that they would do, especially like near the end where we would see some of the bosses of Harry's Millennium and some of the big enemies that Beyond the Grave would have to go and fight against, or who Brandon would have to go fight against. So yeah, there are some cool moments with the animation, but I would say for the most part, it is fine. It's not necessarily an element that I find to be a standout thing within Gungrave in comparison to the character development, especially with its leads. And another thing that I do want to talk about is that I decided to go and watch the English dub of this anime, considering that there are a lot of familiar names who are voices in here, especially for fans of English dub animes. Like you got people like Kirk Thornton, you got Kerry Walgren, you got Michelle Ruff. You also got Billingsley. You have Steve Bloom, you got Lex Lang. Like, you got a bunch of names that honestly you'll probably find familiar in some other animes, including Cowboy Bebop and Ghost in the Shell. And I gotta say, this is also another very strong attribute of this anime, or at least the English dub of it, is that I do find the actors, they actually did a fantastic job. And I think they did great in terms of presenting the charisma and the appeal of these respective characters. Like how Kirk Thornton actually captured very well the strong silent type nature of Brandon Heat, and how he would keep his emotions on the inside, but you can tell that like he cares very much about those who are close to him. Or even Tony Oliver's performance as Harry McDowell, and just the sheer charisma. And you could see how this is the kind of guy that he could talk his way into becoming the head of Millennium. And those are just a few examples worth talking about. But yeah, I do definitely want to go and give credit to the voice actors in the English dub. And I think this is definitely a case that regardless if you watch it either in the sub or the dub, you cannot go wrong. I think they both did pretty excellent in their respective parts.
I would have asked you to come up, but I didn't want to intrude, so I held myself back. On the other hand, maybe I should have come out and said hello.
So overall, when it comes to Gungrave, I honestly feel a little bit mixed about it, but then again, I would say that my experience for the most part is worth it. Now, would I say this is a great anime? In my opinion, not really, because I just feel like there are just two completely different tones that are like almost polar opposites to one another, and that the anime doesn't do a great job trying to mesh these two together. In fact, they barely even meshed. It's more like they just connected, where it starts off with this one anime and then it slowly morphs into something that is completely different. And it can be a little bit of a jarring experience. And like some of the things that they would go and establish in the first, they would sacrifice so much of it in order to go and present something that would be completely different. And I mean, like, these are two animes that are pretty good on their own, but the fact that they try to tell this one major story, I don't know, I just feel like it would have been so much better if these two tones would find a way to work together instead of just being separate and then slowly just hand over the baton to the other. But I will say, though, this is the kind of anime where whatever things that it does is actually good. I think it does it amazingly. And one thing I really got to give credit is in terms of its characters. It has excellent character development. It has an excellent cast, and if you are watching it in the English dub, it has great performances as well. And this is especially the case with the two leads that they do present, because they definitely do carry this entire anime. So overall, I would say that there are some parts that are great about it, but then there are also some parts that they do feel disappointing because they don't have as much of the great parts in there. So honestly, in terms of my recommendation, I would say that, yeah, you know what? This is an anime that is worth checking out. You can actually go and find it on Crunchyroll. In fact, it is available there. And although I will say, one recommendation that I would also ask is that if you do choose to watch it, skip episode 1, because you are going to get back into everything like later on. So if you skip episode 1 and you start off with episode 2 and go from there, you probably will have a better experience, where with the elements starting from episode 2 from there, like the realistic aspects, they will pack a much greater punch. However, I will say that there is also a chance that you might actually enjoy this more than I do. Maybe you will go and watch it, and maybe you'll disagree on how I feel in terms of the sci-fi components, that they don't feel out of place. And if you do also enjoy those parts, then you'll probably have an amazing time with it. So again, that's why I highly recommend that you would go and check it out because, you know, if you agree with me, well, then you'll have a pretty solid anime to go and see. But if you do disagree with me, then it could probably be because you'll enjoy it much more than I would, actually. As for my rating for Gungrave, it's a little tricky to go and determine what to give it, but I think overall, I would go with a 7 out of 10, especially with a lot of these mixed elements. I mean, like, they're not necessarily bad per se. It is very conflicting, but then again, like I said before, what it did great, it did beautifully. So from there, I wouldn't say it's the best anime that I've seen, but you know what? It's still a good one, and you know what? I'm happy that I have seen it. And with that said, that should do it for this review of Gungrave. Now, I would like to go and give out a huge thanks to Merv PH for their amazing support on Patreon, which allowed them to get some amazing rewards, including this one, where they got to ask me to review Gungrave along with watching my videos before anyone else. So if you would like to go and support my work and get some great rewards, then all you have to do is go to patreon.com/animat. But also at the same time, if you have enjoyed this review, then why don't you go and give this a like and also subscribe to my channel where you could join me in checking out many other animated features to look upon, to talk about, and not just review them, but also look into their history. So with all that said and done, I would like to say thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, see you later, dudes.
Keep sleeping, Grave. Forever.